receive those of you who are here in line with, here in person with us, and those of you who are online. You know, before I dive in here this morning, I would be remiss to not acknowledge just what a significant weekend this is for so many of us, really, for our whole nation and for the world, with the marking yesterday of the 20th anniversary of the attacks on our nation. You know, it's been so healing for me this week and meaningful to be listening to stories of folks who were there at the World Trade Center whose lives were forever changed by that day, to exchange stories with some of you about where we were on that day and how our lives changed ever since. So it's so fitting today that we continue our series called Constant, about how God is constant and faithful in all times and all seasons and no matter what. So as we continue to pray together and to work together for God's peace and justice in our nation and the world, I thought it might also be fitting to talk about something a little lighter. Because sometimes amidst all the heavy, we need a little light, right? Is it just me? No, man, we need the light. So I brought a little costume today. Little costume. I borrowed it from one of our students who I think is now off at Donuts and Devotions. Hufflepuff. I got sorted into Hufflepuff. Harry Potter, for those of you who don't recognize what I am wearing here. The books that are a sensation, right? Absolute sensation. But maybe something that you don't know is that before becoming the rich and famous author of the world-acclaimed Harry Potter series, which is speculated to have made over $1 billion in royalties, whose books have a significant portion of a Universal theme park fashioned after them. I mean, man, that's amazing, right? Before all of this, the author of the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling, she was actually a poor, struggling, single mother who was fired from her job as a secretary, scribbling out ideas for a book that would probably never see the light of day, somewhere in a coffee shop where she no doubt could not pay her tab. So before of all of this, Rowling was just this aimless woman. She was struggling, she was lost, and yet, according to Rowling, her rock bottom experience, the failures in herself and in her life, and especially the coming to terms with these failures in her life, it's what allowed her to experience success later in her life. Rowling actually shared this in a commencement address she gave at Harvard University in 2008. Failure meant a stripping away of the essentials. I stopped pretending to myself that I was anything other than what I was, and I began to direct all my energies to finishing the only work that mattered to me. Had I really succeeded at anything else, I might never have found the determination to succeed in the one area where I truly belonged. I was set free because of my greatest fear had been realized, and I was still alive. Rock bottom became a solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. Another way of saying it is that hitting rock bottom finally allowed Rowling to get honest with herself about who she was and who she wasn't, so that she can move in the direction of who she actually wanted to be. Right, so we're in this sermon series talking about how in a world where everything is constantly changing, God is constant. And even, especially in this season, on this weekend, right, church can look and function differently. It's online, it's in person, there are masks, there are no masks. Well, in the midst of all of that, who God calls us to be remains constant too. All right, so that particular who of Highrock, it's described by our church values, the value of hospitality that Willie talked about last week, the values of honesty that Zeb and Bryn will talk about in our video later, but you saw Zeb, articulating so eloquently with his mouth moving, even though you couldn't hear what he was saying. Honesty, though, I'll give you a little heads up. It's about bringing our whole selves to one another and to God. Not just the pretty parts, but also the parts we'd rather hide. It's cutting out the performing that we do for each other all the time. The acting happy when we're totally not happy. Acting like we've got it figured out when we have no idea. Acting like we believe when we're actually filled with this overwhelming and crushing doubt. And honesty, it's the first step toward becoming more whole versions of the people who we actually are, rather than the people who we spend all this time pretending to be. But the thing is, the problem is, even though it could set us free, we resist this honesty like anything. We're terrified of it. We would rather hit rock bottom than tell the truth, even to ourselves. And that's because pretty much everything around us, right? From the time we're born, the messages we hear, the pictures we see and don't see on social media, how we interact with each other, it encourages dishonesty. Like, what is the most common answer to the question, how are you? How are you? Fine, right? And come on, everybody knows. It's like American Culture 101. We should actually present this, Jenna, in our ELL classes. American Culture 101. When an American asks you, how are you, they don't actually want to know the answer to the question. Like if I was in the checkout line at the grocery store and the clerk asked me, how are you? And I was like, actually not that good. I ate something last night. My stomach's a little bit off. Or if I just start bawling on the spot, and I'm like, I'm terrible, my husband and I got in this fight this morning, and we're not speaking to each other, the clerk would be like, I don't get paid enough for this. I don't care about your intestinal issues, and I don't care about your marriage. And that's because we don't really expect each other to answer questions honestly. We don't even necessarily want to see the person behind the presentation. It's true at the grocery store, but you know what the sad thing is? It can also be true at church. Your friends, they seek you out. They ask you for help until your life falls apart. Then when it does, the phone doesn't ring. They avert their eyes when they walk into the room. No one invites you for coffee. It's not because your friends don't care. It's because they just don't know what to say. They don't know what to do with the unavoidable honesty of your painful situation. Has that ever happened to you? Your life fell apart, and suddenly the people who you thought were your friends, they're nowhere to be found. Oh, man, that hurts. And this dynamic of feeling like we need to keep it together to keep other people comfortable or to keep up a certain image of ourselves is part of what can actually lead people to hit rock bottom. That's because when honesty means that we might be rejected, well, then it keeps us from getting honest before we have no choice. Now, I can't tell you how many leaders of church small groups I know, leaders of marriage small groups, whose marriages later fell apart. Or pastors who have counseled countless couples, only to later see their own relationships hit major and sometimes irreparable crises. Now, speaking transparently with you all, it is one of the things that Willie and I are most terrified of in ministry. So scared that we could get so distracted, feeling like we're the ones who are supposed to have it all together, who are supposed to have all the answers, that we'll somehow fail to see our own brokenness, that we'll miss our own fissures and fractures before it's too late. And especially in a self-reliant, individualist, highly competitive culture, honesty is so hard because it hurts. It is scary to admit that we're not perfect. It is hard to say, I need help. And oftentimes, the more success you've seen in your life, like the more you're looked up to as this leader or the answer guy or the answer woman, well, the harder it gets. And you know, the truth is, that's a lot of you right here in this room. Your scientists, your doctors, your bigwigs at the big companies, your straight-A students, your captains of the team. People look up to you. They depend on you. You've got an image and a reputation to protect because as far as anybody else knows, you've got your stuff together. You are expected to have your stuff together. So what happens when you don't? What happens when you can't make the grade? When your relationships fall apart? What happens when you're overcome with loneliness and you start turning to alcohol or pornography to dull the pain that you're living with in isolation? What happens when depression or anxiety creep in? When you're overcome by sadness and struggle, what then? Man, it is an important question. An important question, maybe especially for us right here at church. And it's been said that churches are hospitals for sinners, not a museum for saints. But to be healed, you doctors know this, to be healed, we first need to acknowledge our sickness. And we need to know that we're safe to do so. This is what I love so much about a lot of the characters that we come across in the Bible, and it's certainly what I love about Peter, who we heard about in the passage that Ken read for us a moment ago. Oh my gosh, talk about complicated, right? Peter, talk about weaknesses and doubts and bonehead moves. Like, even if you aren't super familiar with the Bible, you may have heard the story of Peter's denial of Jesus on the night Jesus was betrayed and handed over to the Roman authorities to be crucified, after swearing up and down that Peter would never betray Jesus. What does he do that very night, not once, but 3 times? He denies even knowing Jesus. And earlier in the story, when Jesus began to explain that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer, Peter is so scared by that he has the audacity to tell Jesus how it's going to be. Jesus, you are not going to suffer. And Peter is so off on this, so out of line, that Jesus actually says to him, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." Now, I could go on and on, like the time Jesus took Peter, James, and John up to a mountain where Jesus was transfigured before them, his face shining like the sun and his clothes turning white as the light, and in response to this unspeakable glory, this awe-inspiring mystery, Peter's like, "Well, this looks like a good place to camp tonight. Should we make a fire? How about some s'mores?" Then there's our reading for today. Much has been made of Peter's courage in getting out of the boat to walk toward Jesus on the water, right? A storm is afoot, and suddenly the disciples see what they think is a ghost coming toward them. When Jesus says, "No, take courage, it is I," Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to you on the water." Now, I know some people think that's courageous, but honestly, I don't. It'd be like me saying, "God, if you exist, turn me into a bird so I can fly. And just to check, I'm going to jump off this cliff and see what happens." That's not courageous. That's stupid. But here's what I think is courageous, because I do think that Peter was courageous. See, the disciples are in a tough spot. Right? The text says that the boat was battered by waves, far from the land. The wind was against them. Do you ever feel like life is against you? The waves, the wind, they keep whipping. When we feel vulnerable like that, we get scared, and understandably so. And here's where I'm proud of Peter. Right, he's the same old impulsive guy doing stupid things like jumping to certain death, but he also does what nobody in the boat has the guts to do, the courage to do, what many of us so rarely do. Peter says what he's actually thinking. He says what he's actually feeling. "Oh yeah, it's you, Jesus? Really? Prove it to me. Tell me to come out to you on the water." Now, I'm not saying that trying to test God is necessarily a healthy or a helpful thing. Please don't do anything stupid. What I am saying is that rather than act like the storm doesn't scare you when it obviously does, being honest with God about your fear and your doubt oh man, that is healthy. That is helpful. Have you ever heard of Christians in these really scary or painful situations, and instead of acknowledging it, they're like, oh, it's okay, we can just trust God. God has a plan, right? When God closes a door, God opens a window. Now, those things might be true, at least in some sense. But I can just really struggle when Christians say things like that. When I'm hurting, I can just feel like, really? Where is God in this? Where are you, God? Now, I'm not saying that to go all Peter on God means that God's going to just instantly show up in exactly the way you want, at exactly the time you want, at least in a way that you can see at first. But what I am saying is that the story of Peter and Jesus on the water, it shows us that no matter our circumstances, no matter what we're thinking or feeling, no matter how ugly or mean or confused or ungrateful it is, Jesus welcomes our honesty. He even honors our honesty, blesses it. God wants us to take the risk of stepping out onto the water, the risk of taking the time, having the courage to notice how we feel and to express it, to ask for what we really need. And what's so powerful to me is what happens when Peter does just that. Like, maybe it's stupid of Peter to get out of the boat, but you notice what happens when he does. Even when he gets scared all over again, seeing the wind beginning to sink, what does Jesus do? How does Jesus receive Peter's terrified, sinking self? He doesn't leave him hanging. He doesn't even avert his eyes. The text says, immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught Peter. Peter's honesty led him straight into the open arms of Jesus, arms that catch him when he struggles and falls. And after catching Peter, Jesus says to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? So, oh no, wait. Is Jesus judging Peter after all for his fear? Is he shaming him for having doubts? Well, no, not at all. Because actually, you see the Greek used here for little faith, it's actually a phrase that connotes what one scholar calls a dialectical mix of courage and anxiety, a vacillation between trust and doubt. So what Jesus is acknowledging is simply that Peter is a lot of things at once. Yeah, he's brave and he is afraid. He is filled with doubt, and somehow, somewhere deep within, he believes that Jesus is who he says he is. Can you relate with that? Being a lot of things, feeling a lot of things at the same time. Well, that's how Jesus views Peter. He calls him Satan in Matthew 16, but literally 5 verses earlier, he just called Peter the rock on whom I will build my church. And it's not that Jesus changed his mind about Peter. He just knows what we can have a really hard time acknowledging, that we are a lot of things at once too. That we're whole and we're broken. We're competent and we're struggling. We have it together and we are a hot mess. All of it is true. And it's a relief, really, to just acknowledge it. To be reminded that just because you struggle doesn't mean that you're not also strong. That just because you have issues to work through doesn't mean that you're not loved. Like, maybe Peter's initiative to get out of the boat was grounded in a lack of faith. Maybe he was putting God to the test. But what I appreciate is that rather than pretending like he believed, putting on this happy Christian smile, saying, hallelujah, I love the storm. Don't you just love it when your life blows up in your face? Instead of doing that, Peter speaks honestly about what was actually in his heart. And because he did that, rather than stay stuck in his fear, Peter has the chance to learn that Jesus can take it. Jesus can take our baggage, take our doubts, even take our stupid bonehead moves. Peter learned that wherever you're coming from, Whether you're up or you're down, Jesus is unchanging. Jesus is constant. Jesus is faithful to catch us when we fall and then to send us on our way more whole, more free than we thought possible, more like the people that God created us to be. And it's this faithfulness of God's grace, that's what frees us to be honest. That is what makes us safe to tell the truth. Impulsive, bumbling Peter, he got honest, and what happened? Well, it led him to become the rock on which Christ did indeed build his church. And I got to tell you, if there's one thing that my 40s are teaching me, is that I would rather be honest and fail than spend my whole life hiding, never finding out who I could actually be in the light of day. I am learning that I would so much rather look the fool like Peter and get to discover what's really possible when I trust my real self to Jesus. And my mother-in-law said that to me once. She said, you know, the best thing about getting older is that you just care less and less about what people think of you. I've heard a lot of friends say that. But wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to wait until we get older or wait until we hit rock bottom to get honest? What if all it took was just going to church? All right, no spoiler alert here, I promise. But have you seen Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings? Oh my gosh! If you haven't seen it yet, it's in the theaters and you gotta go. All right, no spoiler alerts, but at one point in the movie, a wise woman says, you are a product of all who came before you, the legacy of your family, the light and the dark, the good and the bad. It is all a part of who you are. Stop hiding. It will only prolong the pain. Oh man, do I resonate with that? And I resonate so much with J.K. Rowling's story, not because unfortunately I'm a rich famous author, but because my own rock bottom experience ended up being one of the best things that happened to me. I've shared this many times with you all who've been around about how my last year in college I just became sick and depressed into this place where I just couldn't do it anymore. It was one of the worst and one of the best years of my life. I was miserable, but I also had no choice but to face my pain, to get honest about it, which meant that I could also finally be set free from it. I've also shared how this time last year, I've actually been thinking about it a lot because it was September when it was the worst. This time last year was another kind of rock bottom for both Willie and I. Like we were so worn out from the switch to online church, from navigating all that came with the pandemic, not just here, but at home in the world around us. And it's what led to us reaching out to the church leadership team to say, listen, we're shot. We're struggling. And what did they do? How did they receive us? With grace. You received us with such grace. You supported us and our whole staff taking an extra week off in that month, and Willie and I moving forward with our sabbatical last winter, and thank you. Because now rather than feeling stuck in that pain and that struggle, we feel glad. We feel happy. We feel alive and able to thrive in new ways in the roles that we're called to. You confirmed for us what Jesus shows us right here in Peter's story. That Jesus invites us to stop hiding, to get honest, to tell the truth about where we're at, because honesty is the first step from who you are to who, with God's help, you were made to become. Later in our video, you're going to hear Pastor Bryn talk about how through struggle, Jesus turns us into these beautiful, broken pots, jars of clay made beautiful by the gold of God's love and grace shining through. So if we have a picture there of it, you can hold it in your mind, and it's going to make sense to you when you hear the story that Bryn tells. Listen, the last thing in the world that Willie or I or any of our staff and leaders here is for you to feel like this is a place where you need to be fake. If that's what this is about, friends, let's pack it up, sell the building, and go home. Let's be done. There is no point in that. There is no point in us not showing up as our real selves to God with each other so that God can heal us and make us whole. Friends, that's why we're here. So how do we do it? How do we get honest? Where did we start? Well, one of the best ways to get honest and to stay honest with ourselves and with God is simply to invite each other into our real lives. Not our shining, shimmering, fake lives, but our real lives. You know the 5 pictures? No. Okay, let's be real. The 100 pictures you take before you get the picture that you post of your family on Facebook or Instagram? We want to see all those other pictures. We want to show those. We want to share those with each other. That's why our church, here we have a men's group called Restored and Free. And the goal of this group is to hold brave space for each other as they get really honest about sexual and emotional brokenness in their lives. And man, if you talk with any of these guys, these courageous guys, they'll tell you they've learned the hard way that hiding only leads to more hurt, but that getting honest, it sets you free. It's the first step to becoming more whole. It's also why we have a soul care ministry here at church. You're like, wait, what? Hold the phone. I've never heard of the soul care ministry. And that is because soul care is a brand new name and a brand new face to a ministry that we've had here at Highrock Acton from the very beginning. We used to call it Highrock Spiritual Guides, but we're now calling it the Soul Care Ministry. It's based on the ancient practice of spiritual direction. What is it? Well, the team is here to offer anyone who hungers for God brave space to listen for God through conversations on topics or questions you might be wrestling with, whatever it is. Like, we believe so strongly in the importance of regular, honest conversations that we actually ask all of our church members to meet with a soul care team at least once annually. And listen, it's not a test to see if you're holy enough, like we're checking in to evaluate your relationship with God. Oh, please, no. Again, let's pack up and go home if that's what we're doing. It is the opposite. We believe that we grow not in a context of judgment and condemnation where you have to be dishonest in order to be accepted. Rather, we grow in the context of compassion, in the context of grace, where we can be totally honest and know that we will be loved, we will be accepted, we will be respected for who we are, for who we're becoming. We want to be a community where it's okay to have weakness and struggle and be afraid. We want to be like a safety net that catches each other, just like Jesus caught Peter out there on the water. A community that shows grace to each other on the journey of faith, where it's okay to be people, not people who dazzle on the water, but people who take risks and fail. So kind of exciting news for you all today. In the past, soul care ministry appointments, they were just for our church partners. But because we believe so strongly in this ministry, as of today, the team is now offering this conversation space to anyone who is interested. So if you're curious about who the team is, we actually now have these little bios on the soul care ministry page. Hopefully by next week, we're going to have some pictures too. If you scroll down on the ministry page, you'll find some common questions and answers you might have about how all this works. But listen, each of our soul care team members could tell you stories about how honest conversations with grace-filled Christians set them on a new path to deeper freedom in their lives, and that's why they're a part of this team. That's why they and we want to offer this opportunity. Now, maybe for you, it's not the Restored and Free group. Maybe for you, it's not meeting with a soul care team. But whoever it is, and wherever it is, I implore you to make sure that you have safe people in your life with whom you are truly honest. No filters. Because getting honest is one of the hardest things we could ever do, and it is one of the best things you could possibly do. Because it's the first step to becoming a more whole version of who you were made to be. Honesty is the solid foundation, the only foundation on which you can rebuild your life with God. This morning, we have the great privilege of coming together to the table of our Lord for the celebration of Holy Communion. It's the table of fellowship that welcomes us as we are. You know, sometimes as a kid, when I thought of Holy Communion, I thought, oh, that means I have to be really holy to go be a part of it. But again, it's the opposite. Jesus did not come because we deserve him. Jesus came because we need him. So we don't need to prove otherwise. At this table, Jesus welcomes our honesty. Jesus meets us with the open arms of grace, ready and eager to heal us, to make us whole, and to send us on our way more free than ever before. So I'd like to invite up Pastor Phyllis and our worship team and all of those who will be helping serve communion